Okay, good evening, everybody. On behalf of KSS, I welcome you all. And today's meet is on video session, master video session. It's a non-surgical one. And today we have Dr. Girish Varvadkar. He's an radiologist, interventional, and he's going to talk on non-coronary vascular intervention. The second speaker for today is Dr. Uddhav Patil, who is our member, and he's a consultant plastic surgeon and a laser surgeon, and he's going to enlighten us on endovenous lasers for varicose veins. Moderators for today are Dr. Anjali Dawle, Dr. Bhupendra Patil, Dr. Sheetal Patil, and Dr. Prithviraj Jadhav. And we have Dr. Hanmant Patil as MMC observers. And now I hope you all enjoy this academic feast for today. And now I request Dr. Mansingh Adnaik to conduct the session. Mansingh, please.
Yes, madam. Thank you, madam. I'm working on behalf of Dr. Basavraj, secretary, who is unable to attend today's meeting. On behalf of our secretary, I welcome everyone, and with our president's permission, I welcome everyone. Dr. Girish Varvadkar would be our first esteemed speaker for the evening. He is an interventional radiologist performing vascular, urological, hepatological, and basically non-cardiac interventions. He is working in Lilavati Hospital, which happens to be my alma mater. I have been trained. I had done my DNB general surgery from Lilavati Hospital. The second speaker today needs no introduction for Kolhapur Surgical Society. He is our own Dr. Uddhav Patil, who is also an interventional radiologist and very famous for his varicose veins work, and also his laser work in cosmetology. Moderators for today's session is Dr. Anjali Dawle, who is treasurer of Maharashtra Association of Surgeons, and Dr. Bhupendra Patil, Dr. Sheetal Patil, and Dr. Prithviraj Jadhav, sir. On behalf of KSS, I welcome everyone on this platform. I also thank Dr. Hanmant Patil, sir, to have to be an observer for today's evening session. And with this, I hand over the proceedings to moderators. Please start the program. Anjali, madam. Hello.
Yes, Dr. Mansingh, I am here.
Yeah, so madam, you can take over now. The program is all yours.
Okay, so the first talk of today's evening, first of all, I at the outset give a very much thankful to the Kolhapur Surgical Society for giving me an opportunity to moderate this session. Secondly, as the topic seems to be interesting, where the vascular interventions and non-cardiac vascular interventions, which is very much important in today's scenario as a general surgeon. Thirdly, the today's speaker, Dr. Uddhav Patil sir, where I have went as an observer and I have been trained under him, and it's a very unique opportunity, sir, to visit you again after a long time. So who has initiated and inspired me to go into the varicose vein ablation. So great to see you, sir. Fourthly, our today's session, the first speaker, Mansingh.
First session would be done by Dr. Girish, sir.
Okay. So I will request Dr. Girish sir to proceed further.
Thank you very much. This is a topic which is very vast. So especially addressing the surgeons. So I will try and keep it as short as possible, but it's very difficult. But never mind, I'll do my best. So you can see my screen and my audio is okay?
Yes, sir, it is seen.
Okay. So basically, this is the minimally invasive branch of interventional radiology. We need a lot of image-guided procedures. I'm attached to a lot of hospitals, but basically, I'll tell you where interventional radiology helps. It helps in urinary, GI bleeding, bronchial bleeding, brain hemorrhage, renal artery stenosis, carotid artery stenosis, peripheral vascular disease, obstructive jaundice, infertility, as well as obstructive uropathy. So basically, this is when I started. I had only a C-arm, and I worked on the C-arm. But now we have progressed, and we've got a dedicated cath lab, everything like that. So these are some of the instruments that we use. And now going into interventional radiology, let me classify it into two. Basically vascular and non-vascular. When you're talking about vascular, we are talking about increasing the flow. That will be angioplasty, stenting, thrombolysis. Whereas reducing the flow would be kind of embolization, filters, valves, etc. Whereas non-vascular, we are talking about drainages like biliary drainages, abscess drainages, PCNs, biopsies, recanalization of fallopian tubes, as well as retrieval of calculi, foreign bodies, and in the entire body. So basically, angiography was first performed and developed with the idea of to help the surgical side, and are basically medical plumbers. So when we are talking about the plumbing system, we are talking about both opening and closing. So the major role is in bleeding. It's distressing symptom. Whenever you have any bleeding, I think the first thing you have to think of is an interventional radiologist. So what we do is we go transcatheter and go and find the bleeder and embolize it. So what are the principles of embolization? You cannulate the culprit vessel, inject embolic agents, forms of the embolic agent forms a thrombus and blocks the blood vessel. So we have gel foam, we have PVA particles, we have coils, and many we have glue. We have many devices where we can block the vessel. So what are the embolic agents available? We have particulate material, that is gel foam, PVA, clots, muscle and fascia. These were older times, but right now we are talking about basically gel foam and PVA. And when we are talking about solids, we are talking about coils, we are talking about glue, silk threads, balloons are still used, stent grafts are still used, but silk threads were when these other products were not available, and we were making do with whatever we had in India. But we have gone away with silk threads, and we are talking about coils, glue, balloons, and stent grafts. So this is an example of a 58-year-old male with worst headache of his life. CT showed a subarachnoid hemorrhage. Angio showed that there is aneurysm of the MCA, ACA bifurcation, and we've gone in and glued a coil. That is intracranial. So, sorry. So there's another example where there's an acute stroke. Stroke 3 weeks ago, recovered. Stroke since 4 a.m. on the day of admission. And if you see here, you are seeing clearly at this point that there is an occlusion. You can see some calcific kind of lesion. It may be calcium there, and that has caused the occlusion. We have gone in selectively into that branch. We have thrombolized the patient, and thereafter we have recanalized the patient. You can see in the right side image. And final, this is pre on the left side and post on the right side. You have kind of reversed the stroke. So that was intracranial. Now let's look at extracranial. This is an elderly man with bleeding from the vascular malformation in the cheek. Without embolization, surgery would have been very bloody. So we went selectively into the AVM, and thereafter we have embolized it. You can see it in the serial images. Now, another example is we are in Bombay bomb blast. I was in Bombay hospital, and I treated this patient in the sense that we had to do the suturing, and I felt a bruising. The surgeon who was the patient was admitted under, he said, "We'll see later." And finally, we realized that this patient, if you see here on the left side, there is a there is an injury which is caused between the jugular vein and the carotid artery. And finally, we have gone in, and if you see on the left side, you will see we have put a detachable balloon and occluded the fistula and solved the problem. Now, let's look at, I'm coming one by one to the bleeding vessels. Now, this is a massive hemoptysis. This is a 25-year-old male presented with massive hemoptysis. Hemoglobin was 7.2, tachycardia 35 beats per minute. BP was about 90/60. We did the angio, and if you see, this is an old case of Cox. He's got a Rasmussen's aneurysm. If you see here, this is a Rasmussen's aneurysm. I will show you the DSA image, and here you can see clearly that there is a Rasmussen's aneurysm. We have gone in and embolized the entire artery. Bronchial artery can be sacrificed because majority of the flow to the lungs is from the pulmonary artery. And then I looked at the right side. You can see there is a very inflamed arteries on the right. And if you see on the left, you are seeing that we've embolized it, and they seem to have stopped all the. This is this is the DSA picture, and this is the DSA picture after the embolization. You can see that the distal vessels are not filling. We also look at the internal mammary in these patients, and you can see a branch of the internal mammary is feeding here, and we have gone in and embolized the vessel. And after that, you can see that there is complete cutoff of that branch proximal to that bleeding segment. Now, when we do angiographies to diagnose GI bleeds, that's also a very, very common emergency that we see. Now, this is the celiac artery. You can see that there is a left gas and here we have gone in and embolized it, and no longer do you see the aneurysmal or the bleeding segment. Now, how do you approach a GI bleed? Most important is that you have to stabilize the patient with fluids and blood. Endoscopy, usually the blood obscures the vision, and angiography for the diagnosis is important. When the patient is stable, you can do an endoscopy, but the patient is unstable, I think we have to straight away go in for an angiography. When to ask for an angiography? When you feel, now this is theoretical, you don't know how much is the rate of bleed, but 0.5 ml per minute, you'll have tachycardia, you'll have hypotension, and these patients are unstable, and that is when you have to ask for angiography. So 86% of GI angiographies are performed about after 6 p.m. All patients have been bleeding since morning. 17% stop bleeding with conservative management, especially with second episode of bleeding on the same day. This is the statistics that I'm saying. Now, giving you an example, there's a 27-year-old male, necrosectomy done, day 7, massive GI bleed. Important to note is that he's got hematemesis as well as hematochezia. Now, hematemesis, when we say, is upper GI. When you're talking about hematochezia, we are talking about lower GI. So, you should not forget this. And this is the angiography. This is the inferior pancreatic duodenum. You can see that a bleeding segment here. When I go selectively into it, you can actually see the contrast extravasating into the pseudoaneurysm. This is from the inferior pancreatic duodenum. So we go in and coil it. That's the coil you can see. But there is the superior pancreatic duodenum, which is very important, because if you go and go into the superior pancreaticoduodenal, you will see that there is still an extravasation. So you have to close the arcade there, and you go from the celiac, go into the gastroduodenal, go into the superior pancreaticoduodenal, and embolize it. That is the time when you have said that, okay, this is fine. But however, remember I said that this gentleman had hematemesis as well as hematochezia. So you cannot forget about the history. So here you can see we went into the inferior mesenteric artery, and you can see a bleeder clear cut at this segment. So we go in and embolize the branch of the inferior mesenteric artery. This is basically the left colon. But saying that, you cannot be happy with that. You have to see all the branches. If collateralization, you have to embolize, and that is exactly what we have done. You can see there is still a bleed here, and we've gone in and coiled the branch which is collateralizing. So this is the final picture of the inferior mesenteric branch, and also the superior and inferior pancreaticoduodenal branch. Now let's go to transjugular intrahepatic portosystemic shunts. There are clear-cut indications today for doing a TIPS. The most important is that the patient is intractable ascites. Second is intractable bleed, and as a bridge to transplant. So the patient has portal hypertension and has these symptoms, then those are the patients we have to take for transjugular intrahepatic portosystemic shunt. You can see here we have gone into the hepatic vein. We have punctured from the hepatic vein into the portal vein. We have created a passage. This is the ballooning of the stent into the portal vein, and this is the shunt we have created between the portal vein and the hepatic vein. Sometimes there is a high chance that these patients are bleeding and have encephalopathy. In these patients, we go transhepatic, go into the portal vein, and coil the entire varix all the way from the stomach, all the way down to the origin of the varix. And that's what you are seeing here. We have gone deep in and started coiling, and you can see the coils all the way from here, all the way down. Because I'm talking to surgeons, it is important that we discuss. Urologists do PCNL for removing staghorn or pelvic calculi. And this is one of the complications of that. Post-PCNL hematuria, you're clearly seeing that there is a large pseudoaneurysm that is here. We've gone into the renal artery and blocked that segment which was bleeding, and thereafter the problem is solved most of the time. Trauma is another issue. This patient had a trauma. Orthopedic surgeon had gone in and fixed the fracture, but he had injured the popliteal artery. Now, in such situations, as a bailout, we have to put in a covered stent, and that's what we've done here. This is the covered stent, and after we put the covered stent, you can see you no longer see the pseudoaneurysm. Now, angioplasty, I don't want to go too much into detail. We know all the principles of angioplasty. So these are the balloons, the stents that we use. And basically what we are doing is kind of fracturing the atheroma, creating a space, and then, if required, putting a stent. So in peripheral vascular disease, what are the common symptoms are claudication, usually, which is SFA. If there is an ulcer and gangrene, usually there is some element of tibial disease. So the history is usually they are diabetic, smokers, most important is we must feel the pulses. And the pulses is the most important. Of course, we do ABIs and other tests, but important is that we have to do a clinical examination of these patients. So this is a classical example who had a non-healing ulcer. He had an occlusion of the SFA. We've gone in, balloon dilated the segment, and we get a good result. Now, give you examples. This is a 53-year-old male gentleman. Tibial plasty was planned. You can see here that there is a total occlusion. Now, this patient had a vehicle accident in London, and he had a trauma to his leg, and they had gone and ligated the anterior tibial artery. And you can see here, this is a ligated anterior tibial artery. This, what you're seeing is basically a collateral. Here, there is a total occlusion of the anterior tibia, and that is why he was having this problem. We have angioplasty the the tibioperoneal trunk, and you see here now all these collaterals that you are seeing are gone, and there is good flow down. So this actually solves the problem. Now, renovascular hypertension, I don't want to go too much into detail, but suffice it to say that we do it only when there is hypertension, which is uncontrolled, and for azotemia. Now, this is an example. You can see there is a tight stenosis of the renal artery. We have gone in and plastered it and then finally stented it. Another patient of the same thing. So I won't go into details, but transplant kidneys is an important thing. Finally, we are going to anastomose the donor artery to the recipient, which is usually the internal iliac or external iliac. And at that point, there is a possibility of a high-grade stenosis that can develop, and the patient will have an increased creatinine, hypertension, and that is when we come into the picture where we go in and stent the artery. And this is a different view, but you can see that we have stented the artery here, and now you have a good flow into the transplanted renal artery. Now, another important thing is a lot of patients have CABG and they start having chest pain. This is a common thing. If you see this is the internal mammary artery they've taken for the bypass. Now, if you see here, there's a tight stenosis of the subclavian artery. In these cases, we have to stent it. Otherwise, the graft, which is the Lima graft, will fail or will thrombose. So it is important that you identify these and do it as soon as possible. So that is what we've done. We've just plastered it, we've stented it, and now there is no stenosis here and there is good flow into the Lima. Now, carotid. Now, I think I need to skip a little bit because there is so much to talk about that I don't want to overshoot my time. So this is a artery stenosis. We have gone in and this another case of, but most important, I must say, is that all these patients where we are doing carotid artery stenting, we have to use a protection device. It's like an umbrella where we deploy it above and then do the plasty, so that if there is any plaques or thrombi that are there, will always get caught into this filter. And this is what a filter looks like after we have done angioplasty. There is a lot of cholesterol that goes up, which is caught in the filter. Another example is when the patient has ataxia, giddiness, you have to suspect that there is a posterior circulation problem. You can see there is a tight stenosis here. We have gone in and then stented the vertebral artery. I just skip this. This is a Bombay is a violent city. A guy, a taxi driver, had a bullet injury, and he had damaged his carotid artery. There was a carotid to jugular fistula. We have gone in and put a covered stent, and this is what it looks like. And after that, there is no. Now we're looking at aneurysms. Thoracic aneurysms is a major issue and is an emergency and an emergent situation. So you're seeing here this 48-year-old lady who presented with massive hemoptysis. You're seeing on CT there's a large pseudoaneurysm developed from the aorta, and we've gone in and put a stent graft, and we have sorted the problem out. Now, giving you another example, this is a patient, a 35-year-old chronic renal failure, woke up for a transplant, and then they found that there was an abdominal aortic aneurysm, referred for stent graft prior to transplant. We planned for the transplant. We decided anyway the kidneys had failed, so we would not bother about the renal arteries. We decided to have a fenestration for the celiac and superior mesenteric, what we call a custom-made device, and maintain patency of the right internal iliac artery, because the iliac arteries were also aneurysmal. Now, why? I'll come to a little later. So this is what this doesn't look really aneurysmal, but if you see the cross-sectional images, this is the MIP images, but you will see that there is a large aneurysm here, which is pretty big, and that is why we needed to this patient. So this is what we did. We got a fenestrated graft, a two-vessel fenestration for the celiac and superior mesenteric, and we decided to deploy the graft. I'll go quickly through this. We deployed it, then we cannulated the superior mesenteric artery here. We cannulated the celiac artery here. We put in a sheath into the celiac artery. We put a sheath into the superior mesenteric artery. We put covered stents into through the sheath into the celiac and superior mesenteric. Once we cannulated that, we deployed the graft. We retrieved the device. We are retrieving the device, and then one by one we deploy, go back on the sheet so that we can deploy both the grafts. Now you can see here we are in good position, and we are deploying the superior mesenteric, and thereafter we are deploying the celiac. Once we've done that, now there is an aneurysm of this the iliac. Now, as a patient, we cannot cover both internal iliacs. That's why we have something called a iliac branch device. So we've taken the device, we've captured the wire from the opposite side. We've come, if you can see here, we've deployed the device. And once you've deployed the device, now we take a wire into the internal iliac so that we can preserve one internal iliac. We've gone into the internal iliac. We've put a covered stent into the internal iliac and deployed the stent here and angioplasty or balloon dilated that stent, and finally then completed it with putting the pajama of the. So we've deployed one limb here, and we've deployed the other limb here, and then balloon it and oppose the stent graft to the wall. But since there was bilateral iliac aneurysm, we had to coil this, otherwise it can feel retrograde. And we coiled the left internal iliac artery. and then covered the whole graph, covered the whole iliac up to the external iliac, and then ironed out the vessel. That's what we are doing here. Here that there is a little endoleak, what we call. So what we did was we realized that it was coming from here. So we balloon dilated to a bigger diameter. And after that, you can see here now there is no endoleak. And you're seeing good flow into both. This is the final picture of that. This is the follow-up CT. You're seeing a thrombosed. This is pre. And this is post. Now you can see the graph. There is no filling of the false lumen or any endoleak seen either way. And this is the final reconstructed images of the patient after we have completed the procedure 1 month later. Now I'll have another 5 minutes. Should I continue or should I stop?
I think you should continue. If it is not taking much time, then you should continue, sir.
No, about 5 minutes.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So this one we are talking about treatment of massive DVT. Important thing is that we are talking about, when we are talking about acute DVT, we are talking about preventing post-thrombotic syndrome. So what are we doing? The earlier treatment was just IV thrombolysis, but we've seen over a period of time that this does not help. So thrombolysis, basically we look at when specifically we are talking about acute thrombosis, we are looking at the same side popliteal vein, and we do puncture, and what we are looking at is we are trying to debulk the clot. Now, in this process, whether we use thrombolytics or mechanical thrombectomy, there are many in the market, of course, for a cost. But the most important is we debulk the thrombus and then give some thrombolytics. So in acute deep vein thrombosis, we've done a lot of patients now, and we've seen such gratifying results that I don't think today there is any role for medical management. Again, I'm saying acute venous thrombosis. So I'll give you an example. This is a 42-year-old female, overweight, no major illnesses in the past, presented with sudden onset of swelling of the left leg, increasing rapidly, admitted in Surat, IV heparin given for 3 days, prior history of chest pain and heaviness in the past 1 week. We've done all the investigations. The creatinine was a little high, so we decided to hydrate the patient, get the creatinine down, gave anticoagulants, evaluated with compression bandage, and then decided to do an intervention. As I said, we puncture with the in the popliteal artery. You see here, we punctured it, and there is complete thrombosis of the superficial femoral vein. So we've gone in and we start sucking out. You can see progressively as we are sucking out, there is increased flow into the vein. We continue doing that and go from below upwards so that there is no distal embolus. And you can see we are progressively going upwards. We can see clots coming out. This is just a small example of what we pull out. And still you can see that there is flow, but it's not going up. It's not entering the IVC. So we then managed to get a wire across. And you can see here, this is a patient, a classical example of May-Thurner syndrome. And we balloon dilate it, and thereafter in May Turner syndrome, we always give thrombolytics to whatever residual clots are there. We thrombolize them and then patient up. And now if you see, you can see the good flow, but finally, if you see here, there is an obstruction here of the May Turner. And then we see here, you can see that there is an irregularity here. And we put in a stent and, sorry. Excuse me. So this is what the picture looks like. Now you've got a good flow. And finally, we put the patient on anticoagulant. So in these patients, some of them do have pulmonary embolism. So when we are doing thrombolysis, what happens is that it also lyses the pulmonary embolism. And you can see here, this is the pre-picture. You are seeing clots in the pulmonary artery. And after we finish the whole procedure, you are seeing that the pulmonary artery is clear. So in some of these patients, we do put filters, some of them we don't put filters. So I don't want to go and which patients we should put filters. That is another topic. So basically, I'll say all these procedures, safe techniques, simple techniques, inexpensive hardware most of the time. Use of PPA is good and quick results. Keep stents ready in case there is a May Turner syndrome. Most important is this is a new look to an old problem. And in conclusion, interventionists, for us, we have to face the challenges, better understanding, aggressive approach, patience, knowledge of available material, and most important is we have to handle the clinical problems. We can't leave it to the physician to decide because we have sorted it out. We have to manage the medical problems. Basically, it is dedication and patience that we have to have, and we have to aim high and play safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Girish, sir.
I'm sorry I over-exceeded.
As Dr. Mansingh has given us the permission, no problem, sir. So I will request moderators, other moderators like Dr. Bhupendra Patil and Sheetal Patil to take over.
Should we ask the questions right now or should we wait for the whole discussion to get over?
No, wait
Mansi?
for the whole discussion to get over.
Yeah, I guess
Okay.
so.
We'll have the question answer at the end.
Okay.
I guess we
Then
can proceed.
problem.
next, we should proceed to the next stop.
Yeah, yes, ma'am.
Yes,
I think
yes.
so.
Okay. Now,
Dr.
thank you.
Uddhav Patil.
Yeah. Now the next speaker is Dr. Uddhav Patil, sir, who will be speaking on varicose vein and the radio ablation and the laser ablation procedures for the same. Welcome, sir.
Thank
So
you.
can I break in for a moment, please, sir?
Yeah.
I would request other people just to cut down or mute their audio because it is disturbing the entire audio of the entire program, sir. So that is the only issue. I would request and Mahesh, if you can sort that out. Thank
Okay.
you.
I will share my screen. One second. Let me open my presentation first. One second. Yeah.
In the meantime, Dr. Uddhav Patil, sir, is president of Maharashtra Association of Plastic Surgeons and he is the founder president of Deccan Association of Plastic Surgeons. He has made Kolhapur Surgical Society proud by his achievements and he is in active practice in Kolhapur, sir. Sir,
Yeah. First of all, let me thank our own society, our president who is absent today, Vice President ma'am, Basavaraj Kadalge, and a very eminent team of moderators. We have Patil Kapil, Sheetal, as well as Bhupendra. I can call this as a red and blue couple, because they are doing everything in cardiovascular. So entire system has been covered. Okay, and we have our own Prithviraj also, who is our interventional radiologist here. And of course, Anjali, you have heard her, and all of them are there. Now, let's begin with the topic actually I had given was endovenous lasers with some recent advances, because definitely all of us, we like to know what is going on in the world ahead of time. I would start with this, that for varicose vein management, when we talk about the definitive treatment, we all should realize that this being a chronic problem, a chronic disease, the entire algorithm or entire spectrum is very wide, and definitive treatment is just one part of the entire scenario. Actually, it starts with a very good assessment, which is both anatomical as well as pathophysiological. Then we have to fit it into a good CAP classification. And then comes the definitive treatment, but it doesn't end there. Actually, the follow-up aftercare is equally important, which can be taken care with compression stockings, foot-leg exercises, skin care, and wet control. For the lack of time, as well as this being a video workshop, straight away we'll go to the definitive treatment. And the definitive treatment of varicose veins can be broadly divided into thermal and non-thermal, as you know it. Thermal, where heat is being used as the energy source. And in non-thermal, we have chemical with which we can close. We have mechanical abrasion of the intima combined with some chemical. And lastly, we have adhesive or the glue. When we are talking about heat as an energy, we have two which are most commonly used. Those are the lasers and radio frequency. Also, we have steam under pressure and microwave as the heat energy. In the chemical, it can be used in the form of liquid or in the form of foam. And in mechanical, combined with the chemical, it's called as MOCA. We have two systems at the moment. One is Clariven from USA and Flebogrif from the Poland. And we have adhesives or glue called cyanoacrylate closure or CAC. We'll go into the details of lasers and we'll just touch upon the other modalities of treatment. When we are talking about endovenous lasers, again, there are two groups. One is diode, one is Nd:YAG. In the diode, it all started almost 20 years back with 10 nanometer, then it went to 940, 980. Also, we had 1064 Nd:YAG. And now we have this 1470 and 1320. These are the two wavelengths which are absorbed in water and which are mostly in use nowadays. If you go through the history, we can understand it better, how the things have evolved, because we have gone through the entire spectrum since we are using it. Initially, it was 810 nanometer wavelength of the diode. This is the absorption chart of different wavelengths. Here we have wavelengths on x-axis and we have the absorption coefficient on the y. This is the line of water absorption. This is the line of oxy as well as deoxyhemoglobin, which are almost similar. So 810 nanometer had more absorption in the blood than in the water. So the rate of complication like ecchymosis and other things was more. When 940 came into use, you can see here the absorption is almost equal in water as well as in blood. So the incidence of side effects went decreasing as well as the efficiency increased. Then we have 980, which has more absorption in the water than in the blood. Results still further improved and the complication rate went down. And then we have 1320 and now 1470, which are entirely absorbed in water and not absorbed in blood at all. And they have got given very good results and they are being used. So in a nutshell, I will say that these wavelengths will shortly be relegated to the history and these will be used for some time. Now, of course, we have so many new things to come, which we'll be witnessing. Given with all this, ultimately, when we talk about success of endovenous procedure, when we talk about success, it is not just the closure of the vein, but we are talking about a long-term success because of this chronicity of this problem. What do you think, whether it is a technology, 980, 1320, 1470, or one of those latest ones, the person's learning curve and experience, or it is just the why it is not progressing? No, it is not. I'm sorry, but there is some this thing. Sorry for that. So it is the ultrasound. We don't call it an examination, we call it as mapping, because we need to chart it out on the paper. Where is the reflux? How is the progress? Where are the terminal perforators? And what are their diameters? So everything needs to be charted. Now, as far as guidelines for reflux are concerned, the reflux in great, small saphenous, as well as in anterior and posterior accessory veins, as well as in the vein of Giacomin, must have a reflux of 500 milliseconds, that is half a second, regardless of the diameter of the vein. These are the guidelines from the American College of Phlebology, but there are many authors nowadays which are slightly differing from this, in the sense that though it's a general rule that it should be just half second reflux time, now we think that it should be just clinically on individual patient. Sometimes it can be just 300 milliseconds. And as far as perforators are concerned, it can be as small as 250 or 350 milliseconds, where we should consider it as a refluxing vein. Very clearly, particularly for the students, I like to stress again. Now, this bar indicates that the blood is coming towards the probe, and this is blue, means going away from the probe. And when we place the cursor here, we get the waveform exactly. This is a normal GSV with augmentation. Here you can see it is getting augmented, and here it is getting reflux because it is coming. This is the head end on this side, and this is the foot end. So we have a reflux here. And then we can measure this reflux in terms of milliseconds. And for example, this is 9.900 millisecond. This is more than 1 second, 1.1. This is 1.5. This is 2.2. This means very prolonged type of continuous. Many times the radiologists write, continuous reflux is there. But it should be written in terms of milliseconds. Here you can see it's the mid thigh with the Valsalva maneuver. You can see that clearly it is refluxing for quite a long time. Many times when the veins are very big, we can see it without putting the color. This is the wall, this is mid thigh. Patient is doing Valsalva, walls are trying to close, and you can see even in the black and white, you can see the flow of the blood which is going from the head end to the foot end. So for the bigger veins also, it is very easy to see. What happens with the normal respiration when the vein is incompetent? This is what happens. With every inspiration, it will be sucked. With every expiration, it will be pushed down. The walls will not close and it will go across the walls. Now, we actually started with 940 and 980 nanometer way back in 2004, and then we switched over to the 1320. Now, this particular system, we use a 600 micron lasing fiber. It has got an automatic pullback device, which is additional benefit. And we need, of course, the ancillary supply which is needed. It is FDA approved for the GSV and SSV. As you know, this being water absorbed wavelength, we don't need any blood in the vein, so we need to suck it back. These are the fibers. Usually it is the 600 or 650 micron which is used. Then we have a stripper and a ceramic scissor to cut the end. The introducer kit consists of 18 gauge, 10 centimeter long needle, a guide wire. This is the dilator. And then we have a 5 French catheter, which is roughly 45 centimeter, but we have the shorter and longer as well. This catheter has got a side portal through which we keep on sucking the fumes as well as any blood which has remained inside. Now, this is the Doppler report and the map charting, which needs to be on the whiteboard in the operation theater. And we'll go through a short video here. Usually the access is near knee joint, but it can be lower down towards the ankle if the vein is very large and we need to lace the vein in the leg as well. You can see the guide wire here coming up. This is the head end. This is SFJ. You can see a wall here. This is the terminal wall. We have 3 terminal as well. Now this system has got a fiber test so that we exactly know what is the energy is going to be delivered. This is the best cut fiber where we have a round. This is end cut fiber. And then this is the pilot lamp where we can see. And we go right up to the SFJ. And then we withdraw 2 centimeters from the most proximal part of the saphenofemoral junction. And then the energy is delivered. Now, before the era of tumescence, for the larger vein like this, we used to do probe pressure of the ultrasound. But now, with the tumescence, we can collapse the vein nicely. A jacket of about 1 centimeter all around the vein is created. Now the vein being in the saphenous sheath usually nicely compresses the vein. Here you can see the needle. This is 21 gauge spinal needle for tumescence. This is skin. This is the catheter already in the vein. and tumescence is being performed here. And you can see the vein nicely collapses. It goes all around the vein and beautifully compresses. Another advantage is whatever the energy will leave outside the vein wall will be absorbed in this water jacket, and there will be less incidence of paresthesias and nerve injuries. And then the fiber is withdrawn slowly. For initial 5 centimeter, we withdraw 0.5 millimeter per second and then 1 millimeter per second. And this is how the vein gets closed. Now, here you can see catheter already placed. This is for the tumescence. This is the needle, spinal needle, 21 gauge. And see how beautifully it goes on hydrodissecting the vein from the sheath, and the entire saphenous tunnel is occupied with the fluid. This is anterior lamina of the saphenous sheath. This is the catheter in the GSV. This is in somewhere in the mid thigh, and beautifully it goes on separating. So almost every 10 centimeter, we have to put a needle again in the same plane and go on injecting the tumescent fluid, which need not be cold one. It can be normal saline or Ringer's lactate with anesthetist if you are doing it under local anesthesia, or plain if you are doing it under any other anesthesia. The advantage of this pullback system, it has got two speeds, 0.5 and 1 millimeter per second. It eliminates the human error of pullback, because if surgeon pulls back it little rapidly, there can be skip areas, or if it remains there for some time, then it can burst the vein. So automatic pullback has definite advantage. As I told you, this wavelength is being absorbed in the water and blood is not required. So fumes, because temperature at the tip of the fiber is almost to the tune of 800 degrees Celsius, and to this, by the time it goes to the vein wall, it is around 70 to 80 degrees Celsius or 100. So we need to suck all the fumes as well as blood. We can use a longer catheter as well when we have entire vein which is incompetent. If there are tributaries like this, it is better that we catheterize them initially, because with the tumescence, it can collapse the adjacent tributary, which may be difficult to catheterize later. If many times the GSVs, they leave the sheath and become superficial, in that case, there are chances that there may be skin burn. In that case, we do a lot of tumescence, as well as additional, we give cooling with the ice packs. Additionally, as I say, you should have a chart of nerve distribution so that you can try to safeguard the peripheral nerves. Many times we have saculations or local dilatations in all these veins. How we treat them? Here you can see it's being treated nicely. This much is the bulge, and this is after the lacing. This is longitudinal, transverse view. You can see the sac. You can see the eddy currents inside. This is the color Doppler or ultrasound vein we are doing initially. There is an incompetent wall at the beginning. And this is the guide wire which is being entered. You can see the sac here. This is skin, which is almost flush with the skin. And you can see the incompetent wall here. And then we start with the tumescence. This is the tumescence needle, and this is the tumescent fluid which is collapsing the wall inside completely because of the pressure. And therefore now the application of the laser will be uniformly inside. What about perforators? The guideline is they can be normal when they are less than 3 millimeter, or we call them dilated when they are more than 3 millimeter. Usually, they are competent when they are less than 3 millimeter, between 3 to 3.5. They may be incompetent and we need to establish it. more than 3.5 millimeter are usually incompetent and refluxing, and they can be terminal or draining perforators. This is usually the normal perforator, which needs to be measured at deep fascia level by rotating the probe through 360 degrees and taking the widest diameter available there. Again, you can see this is just 2.8, and these are all refluxing one, where the blood is coming towards the probe, that means deep to the superficial. And there can be direct like these huge ones, which is almost 7 millimeter in diameter, larger than even the GSV normal. So one such perforator can use a lot of problems, pigmentation and all that. This is 7.6 like this, 4.4. And this can be done with the calf squeezing test. How to establish it? You give a pressure on the calf, or you apply a BP cuff to the foot and go on pressing it intermittently. Here you can see, though the perforator is small in diameter, like 3.1 or 3.1 or 3.7, 3.9, 4, and little larger, here we have very clearly stated that incompetent. That means the color direction is changing. So there is no doubt about this, and you need to close these perforators. And for that, we have a method called as percutaneous endoperforator laser ablation, or called as PEPLA technique, which is that way very simple technique. The radiologist or assisting sonologist needs to give a very nice cut in the longitudinal axis. This is the spinal needle which we use, whose bevel is almost 3 millimeter. And we need to enter a perforator of the diameter of 3 millimeter or even less. So unless the cut is longitudinal like this nicely, it is very difficult to puncture it. Here you can see this is the bevel, this is the perforator, the spinal needle has gone inside. It can be confirmed. It can be confirmed like this. Yes. And needs to be confirmed by the aspiration of the blood. The blood has to come out. There is no role of any giving energy perivenous. So you can see some of the perforators here. The bare fiber is being put inside, and then we give the energy. This is the level of the deep fascia, and then we slowly withdraw. We also give periperforator tumescence to safeguard any nerves there. And as you can see here, the perforators can be of different shape. They can be twisted. They can be lambda shape, S shape. So a proper cut is very important by the sonologist, so that you are able to put the needle tip to the level of the deep fascia, just below it, and then go on withdrawing it. You have to remove the needle and then slowly withdraw, and then all these perforators will get totally closed. In front of your eyes, you can check it with Doppler again at the end of the procedure. So proper marking of the perforator on the leg is very important to save time and to do the procedure pretty fast. And there is no contraindication for any perforator glazing. Whatever shape it may be, we can try and we can do the glazing. Many times, because as I said, the longitudinal cut is important. Therefore, the surgeon has to adjust himself or herself to that. So many times the position becomes very critical and tricky. Symptomatic tributaries, they can be treated with foam sclerotherapy. Usually I use STS, sodium tetradecyl sulfate. Polidocanol also can be used. It comes in 3%. We dilute it with 10 cc to make it 0.5%. I use for larger veins 0.5%, for smaller veins 0.25 by diluting it again with the same amount of distilled water. And for very reticular, very fine veins, we again dilute it once to make it 0.125%. And we need to inject it in empty vein segment, 1:5 air agitation I do. This is 26 gauge needle, and you can see small reticular veins immediately they go into spasm. This is with, we can use also the 30 gauge needle. This was a rare case of true duplication where there was a single junction there, SFJ, but totally it was not an accessory one. Now, usually we do this charting to make it simple when the patient comes initially. When we examine clinically, we draw it like this. We mention about the foot arches, peripheral pulses. When the patient gets Doppler done, we mention about the Doppler findings. We mark the perforators are already marked by the sonologist. We measure the distance and make it a chart. Competent veins we mention. Ruling out deep vein problems are mentioned clearly as no DVT. And then after the procedure, the same chart is used where we mark it, the laced veins, laced perforators, the energy given there, and the total amount of energy in joules, whichever was given. And this is handed over to the patient. We'll quickly go through some of the results. This was earlier 918 diode results. You can see here. Bilateral also can be done. There are a lot of local dilatations, overweight patient, and very thick dermatosclerosis, almost 1 centimeter thick. Repeatedly, these patients keep on coming later with open perforators. Now, in this case, we need to do the perforators almost 2-3 times during the next 2-3 years. So this is the importance of good follow-up. Of course, we had our share of complications, like as I said, during the learning curve, very superficial vein, we have the incidence of burns. But now with the water absorbed incidence of burns, even with the superficial veins like this, is almost negligible. And of course, we are taking care with the tumescence as well as surface cooling. Here you can see this is after 1 month, after 3 months, the pigmentation also goes down. Here you can see local dilatation. There are many, very serpentinous. Bilateral can be done at the same time. On the contrary, it saves the recovery time. The pain part after the procedure is not very severe, can be managed with 650 milligram of paracetamol. Usually we don't give NSAIDs because this is the aseptic inflammation which we want there. The pigmentation part, patient will keep on asking you, it will reduce, but it may not go because it is the iron pigmentation there. Usually the tributaries which are near the ulcer are supposed to be laced, and we lace them. Sometimes they are very superficial and they can get necrose. Being a plastic surgeon, we can just graft them at the same sitting and give them relief. This is after 6 years. You can see the graft nicely and the pigmentation is also going down. This is severe grade of dermatosclerosis, but the ulcer has remained healed with the grafting procedure. In dermatosclerosis, of course, the diameter is not going to improve because it's very strict. About the other complications, pain, as I said, is not very severe. Ecchymosis was more with the 810, 940, 980 blood absorbing wavelengths. It is very less with the newer wavelengths. Superficial burns incidence in the literature is more with the radiofrequency ablation than with the laser. It is as less as 1 in 750 to 700 patients like this. It can be sometimes. And now we have started doing lot of tumescence to safeguard against this. So tremendous amount of tumescence will safeguard it. arteriovenous fistulas are extremely rare. There are only 11 cases which are recorded in the literature. DVT, pulmonary embolism, is also very less, 1 in 2,000 to 5,000. Endothermic heat induced thrombosis means we do not ligate the SFJ or SPJ. We start ligating from 2 centimeter and a clot is formed there which can extend up to the SFJ or SPJ. Post-operatively, patient is supposed to have slow walk for 20 minutes immediately after the procedure so that the blood flow in the deep veins keeps on continuing and doesn't allow the end clot to extend into the deep veins. So there are classifications of this endothermic clot, like class 1 right up to the junction, extending halfway, extending 50% and complete like this. This can be managed by a routine diagnostic Doppler on the day of discharge or on the 2nd or 3rd day. But the incidence is very low. If you restrict yourself to 2 centimeter from SFJ, most proximal part of the SFJ, that is most important because SFJ itself can be almost 1 centimeter. And as far as SPJ is concerned, saphenopopliteal junction is concerned, usually the saphenous, small saphenous vein very slowly goes and meets the deep vein, so that there usually I keep 3 to 3.5 centimeter from the SPJ. So this was about this thing. This is iatrogenic complications. Sometime during our career, we do face it. This is what you can see white here, incised through 1 centimeter. This is the shin of the patient. And this is the dilator, because when the vein is tortuous, you tend to push it. And if your set is little older one, this dilator becomes stiff because they are plastic and they can break inside. And therefore, no problem. If you detect it, then and then only ultrasound probe can detect it. You can pinpoint it. You can just explore and remove it. Here you can see, it's broken into, this is manually broken. This was the piece which had remained inside. And therefore, now it is our practice to mention what is the portion of the dilator which is projecting in front of the catheter. Every time the catheter is inserted, we measure this and our assistant writes on the blackboard. At the same time, your glass fiber also can break inside and difficult to find because it is very small. Therefore, the tip of the fiber, where the cladding is removed, what we call as bare tip, bare fiber tip, that also we need to measure. Usually it is 5 to 6 millimeter, but still we need to measure it. When we withdraw it, we again check it that the entire thing has been removed. And we never force the catheter as well as fiber against any resistance. It is always done under vision so that these type of iatrogenic complications are reduced to a great extent. About the 4 recent advances, very quickly we will go through. They are very interesting. A French group started using steam under pressure because, as we all know, 100 degrees Celsius is the temperature of the boiling water. But if the steam is kept under pressure, the temperature can go right up to 170 degrees Celsius. So here is the system. Rest of the things are same as what we do in laser. It is accessed through a small catheter near the knee and done under ultrasound guidance. And here you can see in the inset, the puffs or pushes of the steam are given. Here you can see, and then the catheter is withdrawn. Again, one more puff is given. Catheter withdrawn, puff is given. And this temperature is sufficient to cause protein coagulation of the vein wall, and the vein wall closes. Now, unfortunately, this has not been popularized too much. But of course, there is a team which is doing it and we have witnessed that. Now, microwave ablation, now it is available. There is one center in India I could pinpoint where they are using it. In the literature, this microwave as heat has been used since 2009. There are only 6 papers when you search the PubMed. Out of 2 are experimental on animals. 3 are clinical. Out of these 3, 2 are from China. 1 is from Thailand. Out of these two from China, one is the same which used on the animals. The occlusion rate quoted at the moment is 80%, and the numbness incidence is quite severe to the tune of 32%. So probably this also has not gone into favor. But the next two, the MOCA, that is mechanochemical ablation, and the glue ablation, they are in favor nowadays. Now, what is MOCA? It's a hybrid system where dual injury is given. It is non-thermal. So no tumescence is required. That is the one more advantage, because in tumescence, we need to give almost 6 to 7 pricks to the patient all along the vein. Here, local anesthesia is only at the insertion site. Mechanical device uses a 4-French catheter, which is slightly smaller than our one, and the tip of the wire rotates at 3,500 RPM to ablate the vein intima from inside. At the same time, infusion of a sclerosant is done through the wire tip for the end chemical ablation, where polydocanol or STS, both of them can be used in the concentration of 1.5%, and this is the quantity. We'll quickly see a video of this.
Veins. The revolutionary low-profile Claravane system combines mechanical action with the infusion of physician-specified fluid. Effectively, all caliber design offers easy access and threading. Typically deployed through a 4 or 5 French microintroducer under ultrasound guidance, the catheter tip shows brightly. Upon activation, the unique rotating ball dispersion tip rotates at approximately 3,500 RPM, creating a targeted penetration of liquid sclerosant, leading to vessel closure. After 2 to 3 seconds of pullback, the operator begins infusing the agent, while pulling back at the average rate of 1 centimeter per 6 to 7 seconds.
The treatment catheter actually comes up. Okay. And through this device, what we do is that the machine rotates it around like that, as such, actually causes the vein to collapse. At the same time, we inject the chemical to close up the vein. So actually, the more technical way to describe it is called MOCA, mechanical chemical ablation therapy. So no use of heat energy. And you realize, even though, I mean, from the sound, it sounds a bit scary. Actually, it's very atraumatic. I'm putting my hands here, so that there's no pain. There's no, doesn't hurt the hand. It's actually very, very soft. It's actually very soft device.
So that was the MOCA. There are reports of that using polydocanol as well as STS. The short-term occlusion rates are very good, to the tune of 91%. They say that this is a faster procedure than endovenous laser, can be done in 44 minutes. And it can be done in a lesser time than the laser as well as radio frequency. But this is one of the recent article, 2017, where they have done in a large series of 1200 GSVs. Occlusion rate is again 92%, which is in the short term, 1 year and 3 year, it has gone down to 87%. Nerve injury is very rare. That is the very plus point, because in all methods which use heat, there is always a chance of paresthesia because heat can penetrate outside the vein wall. So this is the greatest advantage of this particular system. Cyanoacrylate closure again comes in the category of non-thermal. It's a gun which is available. This is again a short video. There are two systems. This is from USA, Venus Seal.
With local anesthesia, the catheter is then advanced near the saphenofemoral
The rest
junction,
of the procedure
also
is
known
same.
as the SFJ, which is in the upper leg. Under ultrasound guidance, the catheter is positioned appropriately just below the SFJ. Compression is applied with the ultrasound transducer above the catheter in order to coax the vein. The first injection of the adhesive is precisely administered. The catheter is pulled back 1 centimeter. A second injection is made and the catheter is pulled back 3 centimeters. Gentle compression is also applied with the practitioner's free hand near the ultrasound transducer. After the tip of the catheter is located with ultrasound transducer, the transducer is advanced above the catheter. Compression is applied and an injection is administered from the dispenser gun. The catheter is pulled back 3 centimeters. Compression is applied with the practitioner's free hand. This routine is repeated throughout the length of the diseased varicose vein.
Here, some of the complications, inflammatory reaction, phlebitis, they have been noted. We have reports available now in 2017, 2019 also, granuloma formation following cyanoacrylate glue. Now, here we need to now see for the long-term results of these particular procedures, though the closure rate is very good. The equipment is a little costly because almost it will go to the tune of 75 to 80,000 rupees for that gun, which is there. Needs to be very carefully done because if the cyanoacrylate spills out, then the catheter can get blocked and all that thing. So advantage of the endovenous procedures over surgery, I need not narrate, you all know by this time. Advantages of lasers or radio frequency are they are easier technique to learn and master, less expensive procedure. This is very true for our country. Equal GSV closure rates quoted 94 to 95%, which we also have observed. And there are consistent long-term results, which is very important. Advantage of non-thermal or thermal, as I said, incidence of nerve injury is negligible, 0.2. No tumescence anesthesia, no multiple pricks are required. But the caution is that we need to wait for the long-term results because, as I said, this being a chronic disease, our achievement should be in the long term. 1320 Nd:YAG laser advantages over the diode, very obvious. It is overall gentler on the patient than the earlier wavelengths. Last slide, journey of the varicose veins, if you see, right from the earlier area, you can see it was the surgery like ligation, stripping, phlebectomy, sepsis, and then came the non-surgical in the sense or minimally surgical, where vein was not removed from the body. It was there, but it was closed by endovenous ablative procedures. Initially, it was done with chemical, then thermal, all these, and then we have non-thermal. But what is next going to be? So what I feel is it's all related to hemodynamic restoration, and that can be done by very accurate measuring of the pressure in the veins, because we on one hand call it as a venous hypertension. For arterial hypertension, we have measurement at the cuff, we have measurement at the ankle, but we don't have measurement for the venous pressure because it's a vast tree. There are a lot of tributaries. But if in the future there is a gadgetry which can accurately measure the pressures in different elements or different sections of the vein, and then we can restore it back to the normal pressure, then there may be a day when we don't have to remove or occlude any veins. Of course, initially it was all anatomy based. Now it is going to be shifted towards the pathophysiology based. At the end, remember, endovenous procedures do not correct the problem in its true sense. Rather, they exclude the problematic vein segments from the pathological circulation in an attempt to re-establish physiological circulation. And therefore, our endovenous surgery should incline towards bare minimum exclusion of veins rather than the way around, that means removing or closing lot of veins. Take home message: though the scientific evidence should always be combined with the physician's clinical experience and the patient's preference when the best treatment is selected for an individual patient. As far as long-term success rate are concerned, I will put it like this: if you have less than ideal technology at your hand and your experience is also new, then you can achieve results, no doubt about that. When you get very good experience with the same technology, you can still more improve. But if you get the technology which is best, and even if you start initially, you can achieve better results. And of course, when you get more experience with that best technology, you can really give a very good long-term success to these patients. With this, you can see this was in Sweden I spotted. You can see the varicose veins here. At the end, I thank you once again. And of course, if there is permission, we can go for the question and answer. Thank you very much.
I think Uddhav Patil sir, that was a marvelous presentation, and actually we felt like that everybody can go and start varicose vein, as simple it was. So congratulations, sir. Now coming to the questions, so I will request other moderators to go with the Girish sir's questions first, and then later on we can move on to varicose vein session.
Yeah, good evening, sir. So this is Dr. Bhupendra Patil. It was a very good presentation by both of you. So, sir, there are the most common, I guess, the vascular problems which have been encountered, especially in the postgraduate practice, was deep venous thrombosis. So this question would be actually to Girish sir, and then a follow-up question to Uddhav Patil sir. So Girish sir, what are exactly your, let's say, thresholds for actually intervening in a acute venous thrombosis patient, and what exactly is a line of action? Because what I had studied is it's a slow flow system. Earlier surgical embolectomy was attempted, so but since it was slow flow system, rethrombosis was a very common complication and it yielded very poor results. Plus the dislodgement of the clot and then eventually landing up between the right side of the heart and pulmonary artery was very common. So it was a very poor post-procedural complication. So what is exactly your threshold and idea regarding the intervention? And sir, just a second. And so then a follow-up question